6 minutes, someone whispered, as if saying it quieter might slow it down. But the number hung in the air anyway, bright and indifferent, projected above the Queen's bed like a countdown the universe refused to negotiate with. And Queen Lyra lay perfectly still beneath it, not weak, not broken, just fading in a way that made the most advanced medical systems in 3 sectors look suddenly uncertain, their soft lights flickering like they were thinking too hard and getting nowhere. While a room full of alien physicians, each one decorated, brilliant, and very carefully composed, stood in a silence that wasn't respectful so much as defeated, the kind of silence that happens when every answer has already been tried and politely failed. And Ethan Cole, human doctor, temporary consultant, and very much not supposed to be here, stood near the back trying to look like part of the equipment, which was easier than it sounded because no one had spoken to him in the last 20 minutes, and the machines at least had the courtesy to pretend they were useful. He folded his arms loosely, watching the data cascade across translucent panels that adjusted themselves like they were embarrassed by what they were showing, degradation curves, neural collapse projections, probability estimates that dipped lower every time they refreshed, and he exhaled slowly through his nose, because he had seen patterns like this before. Not identical, never identical, but close enough to feel wrong in a familiar way, like a song played slightly off-key. And somewhere near the center of the room a senior physician spoke, voice steady, practiced, "We are approaching terminal threshold," which was a very elegant way of saying they were out of time, and no one argued, because arguing required options, and options had quietly left the room several updates ago. Ethan tilted his head a few degrees, the way he always did when something didn't line up, and glanced again at a minor fluctuation buried beneath more impressive data. A tiny irregularity the system kept smoothing out like it didn't belong, and he felt that small, persistent itch of recognition, the one that had gotten him into trouble more than once, because noticing things was only useful if you were allowed to say them, and he wasn't. Not really. Not here. Not in a room where entire careers had been built on understanding this physiology. But the number above the Queen ticked down again, 5 minutes and 32 seconds now, and the silence deepened, not heavier, just settled, like everyone had collectively agreed not to disturb the inevitable. Ethan shifted his weight, just slightly, enough to remind himself he was still part of the physical world and not just observing it. And before his better judgment could file the appropriate paperwork, he heard his own voice cut into the room, calm, almost conversational. "You're treating the wrong failure." And for a moment nothing happened, which was impressive given how many people had just decided to notice him at the exact same time. Then someone turned, sharply, eyes narrowing in a way that translated well across species. "Explain," the physician said, not inviting, not hostile, just controlled, and Ethan rubbed the back of his neck briefly, a habit he had never quite managed to outgrow. "Your models assume primary degeneration," he said, stepping closer to the display like it might run away if he didn't keep an eye on it. "But that fluctuation right there," he pointed, not dramatically, just enough, "that's not decay. That's a trigger cascade being misread as structural failure." A pause, then a softer addition, "which means you're trying to stabilize something that's actively resetting itself." The room did not react loudly. It reacted precisely, a few heads tilting, a panel recalibrating, the AI pausing half a beat longer than usual before continuing, and then the answer came back the same as before, failure, and someone let out a quiet breath that might have been relief or irritation. "Impossible," another voice said, more certain this time, and Ethan nodded once, because that was fair, usually, he agreed, glancing up at the countdown as it slipped under 5 minutes, but not always, and that was when the Queen's eyes opened just enough to find him across the room. Not searching, not confused, simply focused, as if she had been listening the entire time and had just decided he was worth the effort. And when she spoke, her voice was soft, steady, and carried farther than it had any right to. "Then show me." And for the first time since he had walked into the chamber, Ethan felt the room shift, not in volume, not in light, but in attention, like something old and very precise had just leaned forward to see what he would do next. No one moved immediately, which Ethan decided was either a good sign or a very formal way of letting him fail in peace. And he stepped fully into the circle of light as the displays adjusted around him. their surfaces tilting like attentive listeners who had finally found a new speaker worth the inconvenience. He could feel the weight of the room now. Not hostile, not welcoming, just precise, measuring, cataloging every movement he made as if he were another variable to be tested. And he exhaled once, slow and controlled, because this was the part where thinking had to outrun doubt. I need access to the primary control layer, he said, and a few of the physicians exchanged looks that translated clearly enough as absolutely not, one of them speaking without looking at him. That layer is restricted, which Ethan found reasonable, given that it controlled life support for a queen and presumably did not appreciate improvisation. Then give me a sandbox mirror, he replied, tone still even. Or you can continue watching the same failure in higher resolution. That earned him a sharper look, the kind that usually preceded a long lecture or a short dismissal. But before either could arrive, the queen's hand shifted slightly against the surface beneath her, not a dramatic motion, just enough to register, and the system responded instantly. Permissions unlocking in a cascade of quiet confirmations that sounded almost like reluctant agreement. Ethan blinked once, then nodded faintly. Thank you, he said, not to the system, and stepped closer to the interface, the data expanding at his approach, layers unfolding like a map that had been waiting for someone to read it differently. He moved his fingers through the projections, not touching so much as guiding, isolating that small irregularity again and forcing the system to stop smoothing it out. There, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. You keep correcting it because it does not match your baseline. The AI responded with a soft tonal shift, acknowledging the command but not agreeing with the premise. Of course you do. Ethan added under his breath. You were trained to prefer consistency over truth. A few of the physicians stiffened at that, but none interrupted, which Ethan took as progress. The anomaly pulsed faintly now, no longer hidden, repeating in tight intervals that did not align with any known degenerative pattern. This is not collapse, he said, louder now. It is a cascade trigger resetting neural pathways faster than your stabilization protocols can compensate. He adjusted the model, rerouting one of the simulated responses, and the projections flickered, recalculating, then halted again. Failure, the same as before, a quiet confirmation that nothing had changed. Someone behind him let out a restrained breath that sounded suspiciously like vindication, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, studying the result. Right, he said softly. Because you are still treating the effect, not the cause. He shifted his approach, this time not trying to stabilize the structure, but to interrupt the trigger itself. A small change, almost insignificant on the surface, but the kind that rewrote the logic underneath. The system hesitated, longer this time, the lights dimming fractionally as processing load increased. And for a moment the room seemed to lean with it, attention tightening. The silence no longer resigned but focused. Run it, Ethan said quietly, and the simulation executed. The cascade triggered as expected, then slowed, not stopped, not reversed, but slowed enough to register as something new, something the system had not predicted. A ripple moved through the displays, data shifting, probabilities adjusting by fractions that suddenly mattered, and no one spoke. Because speaking would have broken the fragile shape of what they were seeing. Ethan exhaled again, a little more tension leaving his shoulders. It is not a cure, he said, before anyone could ask the wrong question. It is a way to buy time by breaking the loop. Another recalculation began, deeper this time, drawing from layers of data that had previously been dismissed as irrelevant, and the result came back different. Not success, not yet, but no longer immediate failure. And that was enough to change the room. Subtly but completely, the physicians were no longer ignoring him. They were watching, really watching, and behind him, he could feel the queen's gaze again, steady, unblinking, not hopeful, not desperate, but something far more dangerous, recognition forming in real time, as if she were not just seeing what he was doing, but understanding what it meant. And when Ethan finally glanced back at her, just for a second, he realized with a small, quiet certainty that the decision had already been made before anyone said it out loud. Do it, the queen said, and it was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried through the chamber with the kind of authority that did not require repetition. and every system in the room seemed to adjust around that single decision as if reality itself had been given new instructions. The physicians did not argue, which Ethan found more unsettling than resistance, because silence from experts usually meant they were already recalculating their opinions in private. And he nodded once, mostly to himself, because agreement felt unnecessary. At this point, then turned back to the interface as the system granted him full operational access, the displays widening, deepening, exposing layers that were never meant for improvisation, and he rolled his shoulders slightly, a small motion, grounding, before letting his hands move again through the projections, slower this time, more deliberate, because theory had just become responsibility, and responsibility did not appreciate guesswork. "We are not stabilizing her system," he said, partly for the room, partly to keep his own thinking structured. "We are interrupting the trigger cascade long enough for her baseline to reassert itself." One of the physicians stepped closer now, no longer dismissive, eyes tracking the data with sharpened focus. "That assumes her baseline is still intact," the physician said, and Ethan gave a faint half-smile. "It is," he replied, "or she would not still be fighting it." That earned him a brief, unreadable glance, but no further objection, which again felt like progress. The countdown dropped under 3 minutes, the numbers no longer abstract, each second a visible subtraction, and Ethan adjusted the sequence, isolating the cascade trigger, then building a counter-pattern designed not to overpower it, but to confuse it, a subtle interference rather than a direct opposition, because systems that complex tended to resist force but tolerated misdirection. "If this works," he said quietly, "it will not look impressive." No one laughed, but a few expressions shifted. Understanding the implication, the system began its execution, layers of code and biological modeling intertwining in a way that made the air itself feel more focused, the lights dimming fractionally as processing demand increased. And for a moment, everything narrowed to the interface and the woman lying beneath it. The queen's breathing was shallow but steady, her gaze still fixed on him, not drifting, not fading, present in a way that made the rest of the room feel slightly less real, and Ethan felt that same quiet certainty again, the sense that she was not waiting to be saved, but evaluating whether he was worth trusting with the attempt. The sequence deployed, the cascade triggered as predicted, and then the counter-pattern engaged, not stopping it, not reversing it, but introducing just enough instability to disrupt its rhythm. The system hesitated, recalculated, hesitated again, and a soft tone sounded. Not an alarm. Something else, something uncertain. "That is new," someone murmured, and Ethan exhaled slowly, watching the data shift, the degradation curve flattening by a fraction, then another, the change small, almost insignificant, but real, undeniably real. The AI updated its projections, the probability of immediate failure decreasing, not dramatically, but enough to register as something other than zero, and the room changed again, more noticeably this time. Tension giving way to something sharper. Focused anticipation replacing resignation. "Maintain it," the physician said quickly, already adapting, already moving from disbelief to collaboration, and Ethan nodded, adjusting the parameters, holding the interference pattern steady. "It will not hold forever," he said, because honesty mattered more than comfort right now, "but it gives us time." The countdown slowed, not in actual seconds, but in meaning, each passing moment no longer a step toward inevitability but a space that could be used. And for the first time since he had entered the chamber, the systems around the queen did not look like they were failing. They looked like they were listening, adapting, trying, and Ethan allowed himself a brief, almost imperceptible breath of relief before the next realization settled in, quieter, heavier, that buying time was only the beginning, and that whatever came next would require more than just being right once. And when he glanced at the queen again, her eyes had not softened, had not weakened, they had sharpened, as if she had just confirmed something about him that no one else in the room had even begun to understand, yet the room did not celebrate, which Ethan appreciated, because celebration would have meant they misunderstood what had just happened, and misunderstanding was how people broke things that were barely holding together. The system continued its quiet recalculations, the interference pattern stabilizing just enough to keep the cascade from accelerating. Not gone, not fixed, but restrained like a storm forced to move. Slower than it wanted to, and Ethan kept his hands moving in small, precise adjustments, maintaining balance rather than forcing change, because forcing had already proven ineffective. "We are not out of danger," he said, not looking away from the data. And one of the physicians gave a short nod, already aligned with him now, already recalibrated from skepticism to cautious trust. "Then what are we in?" the physician asked, and Ethan considered that for half a second. "We are in a window," he answered, "and windows close if you assume they are doors." That earned a faint shift in the room, not humor, but recognition of the logic, the kind that did not need to be explained twice. The countdown display adjusted, no longer showing a direct path to failure, but a fluctuating estimate that seemed unsure of itself for the first time since it had appeared, and uncertainty, Ethan thought, was an improvement over inevitability. He leaned closer to the interface, isolating deeper layers of the Queen's neural mapping, searching for the original trigger point, because slowing the cascade was only the first step. Stopping it required understanding why it existed in the first place, and the data did not want to give that up easily. Patterns overlapping, signals blending in ways that suggested intentional complexity rather than random failure. "This is not natural," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But the room heard it anyway, because everything spoken now carried weight. "Define not natural," another voice said, sharper this time, and Ethan adjusted the projection, highlighting the repeating sequence buried beneath the cascade. "This pattern repeats too cleanly," he explained. "Biological degradation is messy, inconsistent. This is structured." A pause, then a more direct conclusion. "Something is triggering this on purpose, even if the system does not recognize it as external." Silence followed, not empty, but processing, the kind of silence that reshaped understanding in real time. And Ethan felt the shift again, deeper now. The room was no longer just watching him solve a problem. It was starting to realize the problem might not be what they thought it was. Behind him, the Queen's breathing steadied slightly, not strong, but more consistent, and when he glanced back, her eyes were still on him, sharper now, more present, as if the slowing cascade had given her enough space to fully engage with what was happening around her. "Can you stop it?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less precise, and Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not want to, but because the honest answer required clarity he had not yet earned. He turned back to the interface, scanning deeper, pushing past the system's preferred interpretations, forcing it to show raw data rather than corrected models. And there it was, faint but undeniable, a signal that did not belong to her biology, embedded within the cascade like a repeating instruction, subtle enough to pass as internal error, consistent enough to reveal intent. Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not dramatic, just a tightening of focus. "Yes," he said finally, but not by fixing her. A few heads turned again, attention sharpening. "Then how?" The physician pressed, and Ethan adjusted the display, isolating the foreign signal, enlarging it until it could no longer hide behind complexity. "By removing what is not supposed to be there," he said, and the room went still again. But this time the silence was different. No longer about doubt or failure, but about the realization that they were no longer dealing with a disease alone, and Ethan felt the weight of that settle into place, because solving a medical problem was one thing, but identifying an external trigger inside a Queen's system was something else entirely, something that carried implications far beyond the room. And when he looked at her again, just for a second, he saw it clearly in her eyes, not fear, not even concern, but recognition, as if she had already reached the same conclusion and had been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. No one spoke for a full 3 seconds, which Ethan counted without meaning to, because silence like that usually meant something important had just shifted from theory into consequence, and consequence had a way of making even the most confident experts reconsider their posture. One of the senior physicians stepped forward, slower this time, no longer dismissive, but cautious in a way that suggested the situation had just become larger than medicine. "You are suggesting external interference," the physician said carefully, and Ethan kept his eyes on the data, because looking at people right now would only complicate things. "I am saying this pattern does not originate from her biology," he replied, tone steady. "And if it did not originate there, Then it was introduced. The words settled into the room with a weight that no one immediately challenged, because challenging it would require a better explanation, and none of them had one ready. The system pulsed softly as it continued maintaining the interference pattern, buying them time in small, measured increments, and Ethan adjusted the projection again, isolating the foreign signal further, stretching it across multiple layers so its structure became undeniable. Repeating sequences, consistent timing, and embedded logic that did not belong to natural degradation. It is adaptive, he added quietly. It changes just enough to avoid detection, but not enough to lose function. One of the assistants near the far console inhaled sharply, not dramatic, just enough to be heard, because recognition had finally reached them too. That would mean, the assistant began, then stopped, because finishing that sentence out loud would have turned possibility into accusation. An accusation required a direction. Ethan finished it anyway, not because he wanted to escalate, but because leaving it unsaid would have been worse. It would mean this was designed to look like a disease. The room did not react loudly, but the shift was immediate, subtle movements, glances exchanged, systems quietly isolating access logs and background processes, as if the environment itself had become a subject of investigation, and Ethan felt the scope expand beyond his original intent. Because this was no longer just about saving a life, it was about understanding why that life had been targeted in the first place. He leaned back slightly from the interface, just enough to think without inputting commands. "Can you remove it?" The same physician asked again, but the tone had changed, less challenge, more urgency now, and Ethan exhaled slowly, considering the structure he was seeing. "Not directly," he said. "If I try to extract it like a foreign object, it will trigger a full cascade response." He paused, then added, "And we lose the window." The countdown display flickered again, unstable now, reflecting probabilities instead of certainty, and Ethan tapped lightly through the projections, mapping out a different approach, one that did not confront the signal head-on, but surrounded it, isolated it gradually, like guiding something into a space where it could no longer function. "I need to rewrite the response environment around it," he explained. "Make the system treat it as noise instead of instruction. A risky approach, one that relied on subtlety rather than force, but subtlety had gotten them this far, and brute force had already failed." The physician studied him for a moment, then nodded once, not fully convinced, but no longer opposed. "Proceed," he said, and Ethan allowed himself a brief, almost invisible breath, because permission mattered less than alignment, and the room was finally aligned. He moved his hands again, slower now, building a containment pattern that adjusted dynamically, adapting to the signal's changes without reacting to them directly. The system followed, hesitating at first, then committing, and the data shifted again, the cascade slowing further, the foreign pattern losing coherence in small, measurable ways, and behind him, the Queen's presence felt different now, stronger, not physically, but in focus, like someone who had stepped back into full awareness after hovering at the edge of it. "You saw this before anyone else," she said quietly, not a question, and Ethan glanced back just long enough to answer. "It stood out," he said simply, then added with a faint trace of dry humor. "Systems that try too hard to look normal usually are not." And for the first time, the corner of her expression shifted, not quite a smile, but something close enough to change the atmosphere by a degree. And when he turned back to the interface, he realized the room was no longer watching him like an outsider who might be right. They were watching him like the only person in the room who already understood what needed to happen next. The system resisted him, not openly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, stubborn way complex structures protect themselves from change, and Ethan felt it immediately in the delay between command and response. A fraction of a second stretched just long enough to matter. The containment pattern he was building held, but only barely, like a net catching something that did not agree to be caught. "It is adapting faster now," one of the physicians said, voice lower, sharper, no longer observing but tracking. And Ethan nodded once without looking away. "Of course it is," he replied, adjusting the parameters again. It recognized the interference. The foreign signal shifted inside the model, not retreating, not collapsing, but reorganizing, rerouting its pathways through layers Ethan had not initially mapped. And for a moment the cascade spiked again. the system flickering with renewed instability before the containment pattern reasserted itself, slower this time, strained, and the room tightened around that moment, attention narrowing, no one speaking because speech would not help and might disrupt the fragile balance they were holding. Ethan leaned closer to the interface, his movements becoming more precise, less exploratory now, because he was no longer searching for the problem, he was inside it, and inside problems required a different kind of thinking, less about answers and more about timing. Do not fight it directly, he said, more to the system than to the room. You will lose that exchange. He adjusted the pattern again, this time not trying to suppress the signal's changes, but anticipating them, creating space where the signal expected resistance and resistance where it expected space, a subtle inversion that forced it to reveal its structure in order to maintain function, and the data responded, reluctantly, patterns emerging more clearly now, not because the signal wanted to be understood, but because it could not continue operating without exposing itself. There, Ethan murmured, isolating a deeper layer, something closer to the origin point, and the system hesitated again, longer this time, the lights dimming further as processing demands climbed, and somewhere behind him, someone shifted their stance, a small sound that carried more weight than it should have, because it meant the room was feeling the strain too. How stable is this? The physician asked, not looking at Ethan but at the projections, and Ethan gave a small, dry answer. It depends on how much you enjoy uncertainty, which earned him no reaction except a slight adjustment in posture from the physician, which Ethan took as approval. The Queen's breathing remained steady, still shallow, but no longer slipping, and when Ethan glanced back, just for a second, her eyes were still fixed on him, not with urgency, not even with expectation, but with a kind of measured focus that suggested she had already accepted the risk and was now evaluating the outcome, not emotionally, but strategically, as if this moment was not just about survival, but about understanding who he was under pressure, and that realization settled into Ethan's mind with a quiet clarity that sharpened his own focus in return. He turned back to the interface, isolating the signal further, narrowing its operational space, forcing it into a tighter loop where its adaptive behavior became predictable rather than reactive, and the cascade responded again, slowing further, the degradation curve flattening into something that looked almost stable, almost, but not enough to trust. I am not removing it yet, he said, anticipating the next question before it formed. I am teaching the system to ignore it. The physician nodded once, understanding now, fully aligned, and then, the physician prompted, and Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not dramatic, just a quiet acknowledgement of what came next. Then we remove it when it no longer knows how to defend itself. The room went still again, but this time the silence was not uncertainty or doubt. It was anticipation, because they could see the path now, not guaranteed, not safe, but real, and Ethan adjusted the final layer of the containment pattern, locking it into place with a precision that left no room for hesitation. And for the first time since he had stepped into the circle of light, the system did not resist. It complied, fully, cleanly, as if it had finally accepted his logic as its own. And in that moment, the foreign signal flickered, not gone, not defeated, but exposed in a way it had not been before, and Ethan knew, with the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning, that the next step would not just determine whether she lived, but whether whatever had been placed inside her would remain hidden or be brought into the light for the entire system to see the moment the system fully complied. The room seemed to inhale, without permission, not loudly, not even noticeably to anyone who was not paying attention, but Ethan felt it, that subtle shift when control changes hands and everyone realizes it at the same time. And he did not look up, because looking up would invite questions he did not have time to answer. Instead, he leaned in slightly, eyes tracking the now exposed signal as it struggled within the containment pattern, no longer hidden, no longer able to move freely, but still active, still dangerous in the quiet, persistent way complex things tend to be. It is trying to relocate. One of the physicians said, voice tighter now, and Ethan nodded once. It will, he replied. It cannot defend itself directly anymore, so it will try to disperse. He adjusted the model again, narrowing the containment field just enough to prevent that spread without triggering a full cascade response. a delicate balance that required constant attention. Because the signal was no longer passive, it was reacting, adapting, learning in real time, and Ethan could feel the pressure building in the system, not as an alarm, but as resistance, like something pushing back against the boundaries he had set. "How long can you hold it there?" the physician asked, and Ethan exhaled softly. "Long enough," he said, which was not an answer so much as a commitment. The countdown display flickered again, no longer showing minutes in a linear descent but oscillating estimates that suggested the system itself was uncertain how to measure what was happening, and uncertainty, Ethan had learned, was where solutions lived. He isolated the core of the signal further, compressing its operational pathways into a tighter loop, forcing it into a position where its adaptive behavior became predictable, and as it did, the structure clarified, patterns aligning into something that looked less like random interference and more like deliberate design. "It is not just embedded," he said quietly. "It is integrated." A pause, then more precise. "It was built to coexist with her system until it activated." Silence followed that, heavier now, because the implication extended beyond medicine into intent, into planning, into someone, somewhere, deciding this outcome in advance, and Ethan pushed that thought aside for now, because speculation did not help him hold the line. The Queen's breathing steadied further, subtle but measurable, her system, responding to the reduced pressure, and when Ethan glanced back again, her gaze had not wavered, still fixed on him with that same calm intensity, as if she were not surprised by any of this, as if she had been waiting for the moment when the truth would surface, not dramatically, but inevitably. "Can you remove it now?" she asked, and this time her voice carried something new, not urgency, not fear, but readiness. And Ethan turned back to the interface, studying the containment field, the signal, the delicate balance between them. "Almost," he said, because almost was the most honest word available. He adjusted the final layer of the pattern, introducing a controlled instability, a narrow corridor where the signal would be forced to collapse inward rather than expand outward, a risky move, because collapse could either neutralize it or trigger the cascade in a way they could not recover from. And the system hesitated again, longer than before, the lights dimming to a low, steady glow as processing resources peaked, and for a moment everything felt suspended, the room, the systems, even the air itself holding still, as if waiting to see which way the equation would resolve. Ethan's hands remained steady, not because he was confident, but because hesitation would break the structure he had built, and the signal reacted, shifting, compressing under the pressure of the containment field, its patterns tightening, losing flexibility, losing the adaptive edge that had allowed it to hide for so long. "Now," Ethan said quietly, not to the room, not even to the system, but to himself, and he executed the final sequence, not a forceful removal, but a precise disengagement, separating the signal from the pathways it had been using, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, the kind of nothing that stretched just long enough to feel like a decision, and then the signal flickered, destabilized, and began to collapse inward, its structure unraveling not violently, but cleanly, like a pattern that could no longer sustain itself once exposed. The system responded immediately, recalculating, redistributing load, the cascade dropping sharply as the foreign influence lost coherence. And the room did not react right away, because they were waiting, all of them, for the confirmation that mattered, and Ethan did the same, watching the data settle, watching the degradation curve flatten into something that no longer pointed toward inevitability, and only then did he allow himself a breath, slow, controlled, because the hardest part was over, and when he finally looked at the Queen again, her eyes were clearer now, sharper, fully present, and the silence that followed was not about uncertainty anymore. It was about recognition, not of what he had done, but of what that meant going forward. The system did not celebrate the removal. It recalibrated, quietly, efficiently, as if correcting a long-standing error it had only just noticed, and the projections shifted from instability to something unfamiliar in this room, stability, not perfect, not absolute, but real enough that the degradation curve no longer demanded attention every second, and that alone changed the atmosphere in a way no announcement could have. Ethan stepped back half a pace, not out of exhaustion, but to see the full model now that it was no longer fighting him, the data flowed differently. Smoother, less defensive, like a conversation that had stopped arguing and started listening. And for the first time since he had spoken, the physicians moved without hesitation, stepping forward, adjusting secondary systems, verifying what the primary interface was already showing, their movements precise, coordinated, no longer questioning him, but building on what he had done, and Ethan let them, because this part belonged to them, maintaining, stabilizing, securing the recovery that had just become possible. Neural baseline is holding, one of them said, voice. Controlled but unmistakably altered, as if the words themselves carried more weight than expected. Cascade activity minimal, another added, and the room absorbed those updates in silence, not because they did not matter, but because they mattered too much to interrupt with reaction. Ethan glanced up at the display where the countdown had been, and it was gone, replaced by a set of dynamic metrics that no longer measured how close she was to failure, but how steadily she was returning to equilibrium. And he exhaled once, slower this time, because the absence of urgency felt almost unfamiliar, like stepping out of a storm into air that did not push back. Behind him, the Queen shifted slightly, not much, just enough that the movement registered without triggering alarms, and that alone drew every eye in the room toward her, not abruptly, but inevitably, as if attention had been waiting for permission to move. Her breathing deepened by a fraction, more consistent now, more aligned with the system that was finally responding to her instead of struggling against something hidden within it. And when she opened her eyes fully, the change was unmistakable, not dramatic, not theatrical, just present, completely present in a way that erased the fragile edge she had been balancing on before. And for a moment, no one spoke, because the confirmation they had been waiting for was not in the data anymore. It was in her, in the way she looked at the room, at the systems, and then at him, her gaze finding Ethan with the same precision it had held throughout, but now without the weight of imminent failure behind it. Status, she said, her voice steady, controlled, as if the last several minutes had been a minor inconvenience rather than a system-wide crisis, and one of the physicians answered immediately. Stabilizing, Your Majesty, the cascade has been neutralized. The word hung there, neutralized. Not cured, not erased, but rendered irrelevant, and the Queen's expression shifted by a degree so small it would have been easy to miss, a quiet acknowledgement rather than relief, because relief implied surprise, and she did not look surprised. She looked confirmed, as if an expectation had been met exactly as predicted. She turned her attention back to Ethan, studying him not as a patient would study a doctor, but as a ruler would study a variable that had just changed the outcome of a system she understood very well. You identified it, she said, not a question, and Ethan gave a small nod, because there was no reason to complicate something that simple. It did not belong, he replied, tone neutral, and for a moment, the corner of her mouth shifted again, not quite a smile, but something close enough to register as approval. No, she said quietly. It did not. The room remained still, not frozen, but attentive in a new way, because the crisis had passed. But something else had taken its place, something less urgent, but far more significant, and Ethan felt it too, that subtle shift from survival to consequence, from solving a problem to understanding what that solution meant in a larger context. He glanced once more at the stabilized data, then back at her, and for the first time since this began, he allowed himself a small, dry thought that almost reached the surface. Something along the lines of this was supposed to be a quiet assignment, but he kept it to himself, because humor, while useful, had its timing, and this was not that moment. The Queen held his gaze for another second, then two, as if measuring something beyond what anyone else in the room could see, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried that same calm precision, but with a new layer beneath it, something that suggested this was no longer just about what had happened, but about what would happen next. You will remain, she said, not as a request, not even as a command that needed emphasis, but as a statement of fact, and the room, for the third time that day, went completely silent in a way that meant everyone understood exactly how much had just changed. No one acknowledged the order out loud, because no one needed to, and that was what made it different from everything that had come before. Ethan felt the shift immediately, not in sound, not in movement, but in the way the room reoriented itself around a new center, and for the first time since he had stepped into the chamber, he was no longer standing at the edge of it. He was part of it, which was a problem he had not planned for and did not particularly enjoy. He let out a slow breath through his nose, subtle enough that no one commented on it, then nodded once, because refusing a statement like that was not a practical option. In any known system, understood, he said, tone even, and that seemed to satisfy the moment in a way nothing more elaborate would have. The physicians resumed their work, but not in the same way as before. Their movements now carried a different awareness, not just of the Queen's recovery, but of the implication behind it. Systems began isolating logs, tracing pathways, pulling records that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with origin, and Ethan noticed that without looking directly at them, because noticing without reacting had always been one of his more useful habits. The Queen shifted again, this time more noticeably, her posture adjusting as the support system responded to her regained stability, and when she sat up by a fraction, the entire room adjusted with her, not physically, but in attention, as if gravity had quietly changed direction. Seal this chamber, she said calmly, and the walls responded before anyone else could, a faint hum passing through. The structure as external access points closed and internal systems rerouted, privacy becoming absolute in a way that suggested this was no longer a medical situation. It was something else entirely. Ethan glanced once at the interface, confirming the stability metrics out of habit, then stepped back fully, giving the physician space to maintain the recovery, because his role there was complete, at least in the technical sense. The rest of it, he suspected, was about to become far less straightforward. You recognized it quickly, the Queen said, her gaze returning to him, and there was no accusation in her voice, no suspicion, just a statement that carried more weight than it appeared to on the surface. Ethan considered his answer for half a second, then chose the simplest version. It was trying too hard to look like something else, he said, and that earned him a longer look. Not because the answer was impressive, but because it was accurate in a way that suggested he had not guessed. She studied him for another moment, then inclined her head slightly, a movement so small it would have been invisible to anyone not watching for it. But in this room, it landed with the clarity of a formal acknowledgement. Most would have trusted the system, she said, and Ethan gave a faint, almost apologetic shrug. I prefer to verify what systems are confident about, he replied, and for the briefest second, there was something in her expression that resembled amusement, not open, not obvious, but present enough to change the tone of the space between them. The silence that followed was no longer heavy, no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, structured, like a pause placed exactly where it needed to be, and then she turned her attention slightly, not away from him, but outward, addressing the room without raising her voice. This was not an illness, she said, and no one interrupted, because the conclusion had already formed in every mind present. It was an insertion, she continued, and the words settled into place with the precision of something that would not be argued. Trace its origin, she added, and the systems responded immediately, data streams shifting, searches expanding beyond medical parameters into networks that had been silent until now. Ethan watched that transition without comment, because this was where his expertise ended and something else began, something larger, more complicated, and almost certainly less forgiving. He glanced back at the Queen one more time, intending to step away, to return to the comfortable distance he had occupied before all of this. But her gaze stopped him again, not physically, not even intentionally, just by existing in a way that made leaving feel premature. Ethan Cole, she said, using his name with a clarity that suggested it had been filed and understood long before this moment. You saw what others did not, and you acted when others would not. She paused, not for effect, but for precision, as if selecting the exact structure of what came next. That is not coincidence. The room held still again, not because they were unsure, but because they understood that this was no longer about what he had done, it was about what that meant, and Ethan felt that realization settle into place with the same quiet certainty that had guided him from the beginning. He met her gaze without shifting his posture, because anything else would have felt like an unnecessary adjustment, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just long enough to become something else, something intentional, something that carried forward beyond the boundaries of the chamber. And then she said, very simply, "We have more to discuss." And for reasons he could not entirely explain, Ethan understood that whatever came next would not be optional, and more importantly, it would not be temporary.